Well, hey YouTube, welcome back to Petey's Peds. Today's episode is the Ibanez Tube Screamer and all of its clones and variants. So let's face it, the Ibanez Tube Screamer is not necessarily a beginner's pedal. I feel that it isn't. Typically for me, my story goes, I started out playing through little tiny practice amps, graduated up to larger amps with big 12-inch speakers, overpowered stuff, 120 watt like JC 120. Larger amplifiers used on the stage and outdoor events, parties, stuff like that, in garages. And then more recently, playing through headphones, playing through full range, like PA type speaker type stuff, and smaller rigs. For indoor, I have a very small speaker system that I use with an amp and cabinet simulator. So the Tube Screamer works best for that middle variant. If you're playing a real amp with big speakers that's pushing air, this is where the Tube Screamer is really going to shine. So for beginners, they're not necessarily going to be like, wow, I need that Tube Screamer pedal, where they're going to be like, give me that big muff, or give me that MT2, the Metal Zone. Any type of like over-the-top, way too much gain type of pedal is going to be more appealing than how you properly use a Tube Screamer. Now, it was designed because they had switched over from tube amps into Transistor Town, which left a different sound and, more importantly, a feel and how the amps reacted. So part of the Tube Screamer's appeal, and the way they designed it, was to replicate, turn your solid state amp into a tube amp by using this pedal. That's the marketing idea behind it. Okay, so one way of looking at this is that, well, how it's come to be looked at is that we don't use the Tube Screamer to generate artificial or pedal distortion. Now, the reason I said artificial is, I should say external, because there really is no difference between the distortion generated in a pedal and the distortion generated in an amp if they're using an op amp that's clipped by LEDs. The only difference is in the voltage that it's operating at. Inside the amplifier, they're running that off of a large transformer that plugs into the wall, and it's a source voltage of 120 American USA volts. So that leaves quite a bit of voltage to, if they want to run that circuit off plus and minus 15 volts, gives you more headroom. Where when you're running it off 9, you're getting dangerously close to running out of any actual space inside the electronic circuit for the guitar signal to live. So I know that's getting all into like theory and stuff like that, and this episode is going to be, this is my Tube Screamer. It's an Aria, it's a clone. This is an Aria OD10. It's an overdrive that has a 2-stage switch, and there's a secondary gain setting for the second position. This uses a 4558 op amp, which that's the original Tube Screamer op amp. And to be honest with you, that doesn't really matter as much as most people think. Whereas there was a lot of myth about Stevie Ray Vaughan. It turns out he was using a later model. It's called a 10. There's an 08, which is the original, that had a square switch, rectangular stop switch, and the company that was making that switch stopped making them, and they redesigned it into the 9. And that's the one that everyone is more familiar with, that has the rounded aluminum style switch. It's larger, like a tongue. And then the 10 was like a later model that, there's all kinds of models of Tube Screamers. The fact is that John Mayer and Stevie Ray Vaughan shared a guitar tech, and that both of those guys ended up using the 10 series. And whereas Ibanez says they use a cheap circuit board, they use cheap parts. That's what those guys are using. So I think that tone chasing with a tube screamer, you may have better ways of using your money. I think finding the right one for your first purchase rather than going in there and monkeying with it. If you want to make a career out of building and modifying tube screamers to find the ultimate one, I would encourage you to do so. But also consider there's plenty of different overdrive circuits available. The Timmy, the Clay Jones, the Clan. There's all kinds of different circuits that basically have a different way of approaching the same thing. Now, specifically to the tube screamer is a mid hump. They call it the mid hump. And what that means is there's the bass, the mid-range, and the treble. This boosts up and it actually reduces some of the lows. Because when you get really cranking up there and turning it up, some of these amps will get boomy sounding. A lot of the pro players, the way that they use the tube screamer is not so much to turn a solid state amplifier into a tube amp. The way they're using it is not to create external overdrive. We talked about that. Just because the overdrive or the signal distortion is occurring out of the amp doesn't make that a bad thing. It just depends on what you have to work with. And typically, the more features that are put into the amplifier, you're going to pay quite a bit more for that. So it can be less expensive to get a decent amplifier that produces like a one-trick pony, like a good clean amp that's loud enough for the application, and then pick something like that up, get your distortion on the floor and through your pedal board. And then because how the marketing has gone now, there's a lot more honesty in the pedals. People like to talk more about the circuit, so you can figure, well, this pedal simulates a Vox, this pedal simulates a cranked Fender, this pedal simulates a Marshall, this pedal simulates a more modern high gain sound, and then put all that stuff on your pedal board, and then you can have a bunch of tones rather than just spending all your money for one amp sound that has that one tone to it. Something like a tube screamer, paying $100 for this pedal that's going to just boost the mids a little bit, to me doesn't really make sense. Then again, this is a staple classic rock sound that you can use with any amp. It's going to sound fantastic. So tube screamer could be something that could be thought of to even use in front of what I have here, to use it to flavor this. So it's definitely a wonderful tool in the toolbox, but you have to be clear because it's not a high gain distortion machine. Tube screamer, when you crank it, yeah, it does give you a ratty enough type of distortion sound, but really where it shines is as a cleaner boost, where, like I said, we're not getting our distortion or signal clipping so much happening inside the pedal as we are using it to shape the tone, shave off some of those low end frequencies, boost the mids. And let's face it, the guitar is a mid-range instrument. That's where the frequencies live in a guitar. So we're boosting the mids, which is going to make it really stand out, especially for a lead. And then volume boosting it. And while we're volume boosting it, a lot of people will use this as an always on pedal, meaning it's always on as a part of their normal tone. And then we're working on that volume knob where they want a little bit more grit or overdrive in their sound. They just get that by adjusting their volume knob for their song. So to get a clean sound, they have to turn their volume knob down to like 5 on the guitar. And when you turn it all the way up, it's almost like the same idea of a gain knob on the pedal. But in this case, it's on your guitar. And that works really well through a tube screamer pedal. And it should be said that the tube screamer, its functionality is to hit the amp harder. And this is where it gets weird, because I feel that if you have a tube amp that has that feel to it and that sag and it has that power amp distortion that people want. Part of that is it's in the preamp clipping stage a little bit. There's even more in the output stage clipping, even in the speaker clipping, and then adding a little bit of that, intensifying that effect all the way through by having your guitar signal way louder. It's the job of the tube screamer. So it's almost like a clean boost, but it's not clean because it's really shaping your tone. It's boosting up the mid frequencies and reducing the lows. So this pedal can work magically, and it's, like I said, this is more of a player's pedal. It's more for an adult or an experienced pedal who has reached this point in their life where they're like, you know what? Everything that I'm playing sounds and feels exactly the same because there's no room for any dynamics or any expression because there's so much gain. And see, this is a syndrome of younger beginner players. They never play clean. Whatever effects pedals they bought, like they've got a chorus and they've got a distortion and they got a delay, they never shut any of them off. Everything is just always maxed out. And I'm saying that because I had that syndrome too. When you go back and listen to my recordings, and I cringe because it was just way too much. In my case, I didn't have the modulation, and I didn't overdo it with reverb or delay. Thankfully enough, I was working with other people, and I noticed that in their recordings, that they had bought Lexicon reverb units that cost them $500, so they wanted everyone to know that. So all of their stuff sounded like it was recorded in a sewer that was in a cave inside of a quarry excavating site. So let's take a look. So yeah, that's a very good point that he mentions of, that's probably how most people set them. Utilizing just a little bit of the gain from the pedal, but most of the distortion's coming from the system. One of the most copied pedals of all time, and this is interesting, they show a circuit here, which is something called the Son of Screamer, which is a stripped down version that makes it easier for you to build your own, which is designed by Jack Orman, who's a shining star of the DIY pedal community, who has a site called AMZ Effects. He sells some stuff and gives away a lot of wonderful free information. So that's something to think about. Build your own tube screamer. The minimal Son of Screamer would be where you would want to turn to start. And I believe there are Vero layouts for that. The original first integrated circuit chip they used was a 4558D. And that is part of the Mojo, although chasing after the stuff. Brian Wamper does an excellent video and demonstrating how they all sound the same. And there's another Visual Sound has a demo where they swap chips. They've got an amp guitar set up with a pedal, and they try all different chips, and you see how much the op amp affects the overall sound, which is next to nothing. It's really startling, and when you think people are going to go that far out of their way, you think a big part of that is just that person knowing themselves that they went to the end of the earth and spent as much money as they possibly could to hit a dead end of a wall to know they had the best chip in there, which ultimately doesn't really make a difference, but hey, it matters to that guy. And here brings up this article that the Tone Loc series, the TS5 and 7 are junky and they sound kind of cheap. So that's something to consider when you're going to buy a tube screamer, especially if you're going to be using it all the time. I mean, the mini tube screamer that's sold by Ibanez now is really appealing, and that costs $79 new. You either love them or you hate them because, like I said, they're not. It's a tube screamer to me that made it sound like, wow, this thing's going to scream. And then when I turned the gain up all the way, and the particular model that I tried was it was either one of these lime green ones, or I believe it was this one was the one that no, you know what, the first tube screamer I ever played was an original. Correct me, I played these three out of the actual Ibanez ones. Never tried that one or any of these guys, but really, my first impression of it was I couldn't believe how little gain it had. And I'm guessing I had one with a pot that whichever pot they picked to make that one was a really low, well, the gain pot, which is this one, must have been really, really low, because they have a 30% swing on how much resistance they actually produce. So maybe that would, something in that, the parts, whatever stars aligning to make that one that I first played, really made a poor impression on me. You can get a fairly hefty amount of saturation utilizing the gain knob. The Tube Screamer gives you that next step up from clean amp to that classic rock and roll sound, and that's why so many people have used them. It's a mid boost that's popular with blues and rock players. Legendary circuit used by countless guitars to create their signature sound. One of the most successful, widely copied, and modified overdrive pedals in the history of electric guitar. So it's got a gain or a drive knob, there's a tone knob, and a level knob. The drive knob adjusts the gain, the tone knob adjusts the treble, which the tone is similar to a big muff style. It doesn't do that much, but it does remove treble, is what it does. And the level knob gives you that volume, which there is a significant amount of volume boost, but it's nothing crazy. It's respectable. And it's used to mimic the sound of a vintage tube amp. Classic Tube Screamer has a mid hump, which we were talking about, the accentuated frequencies, and the bass is actually reduced a bit. Some guitarists prefer this type of equalization. Helps to keep them sound from getting lost in the overall mix of the band. As far as the variations, the original TS-808 was the square switch with the JRC 4558 chip. And some units had a Texas Instruments RC 4558 chip, which I guarantee there is no difference between these. They're using the exact same die, it's just where they're produced. And some people would obviously think that the Texas would be better than the Malaysian, or vice versa. Really, that's just a bunch of conjecture. TS9 was what they came out to replace the TS-808. Basically, are there pictures? Yeah, here's a TS9. The TS-808 is the original with the square switch that's dark green. And then there's the 10, the 5 sound tank, which these are kind of frowned at. The tone lock, excuse me, tone lock. That's where you push the pots had spring-loaded switches, and you could push them in to lock them in, so no one would bump them with their feet. And that's why they're called tone lock, excuse me, I said it again. These are generally frowned on, although they have the JRC 4558. The early 2016, they had the HW with select JRC 4558 chips. And you can get these chips. Let's, for fun, since I got you here, and we're not going to so much worry about time when I'm making these. Who's watching by now anyway, right? 4 for, so like, yeah, about $1 a piece. And going back pre-2016, these were even cheaper. Oh yeah, see, here you go. Now people are going to get mad at me and say, oh, they're counterfeits. Well, I don't think so. I would go so far as to put money on the fact that these are legit chips. So yeah, the Maxon OD808 is a highly regarded Maxon overdrive. Let's take a look and see what they got. Yeah, you see, look at that one. Ooh, fancy. And the other one is the Nobels. For cork sniffer types, especially if you can find a used one that's Maxon, that's going to give you... The Nobels is the one with the slightly different frequency. It's got a wider mid-hump. The mid-hump includes a little bit more bass, and a little bit more treble. So this is something that it's a Nashville secret weapon, and these are really good pedals. The Nobels are made in Germany, and they have a reputation of being just excellent. So if I was going to recommend, obviously I'm always doing stuff on the cheap. They built it to compete with the Boss OD1 and the MXR Distortion Plus, and what they came up with was something completely different, because it's different from the OD1 and it's different from the MXR Distortion Plus. It's closer to the OD1. Notable users: Stevie Ray Vaughan and Fish guitarist Trey Anastasio. Modifications include mismatched or different diodes, example silicone and germanium. More than 2 diodes. So there's all kinds of that playing around with the clipping diodes, and then kits by snake oil salesmen who charge you $30 for a handful of components that cost them less than it would cost to get some ketchup packs at McDonald's, and then they charge you $30 for that with a little sheet explaining it. These are the people that I really don't hold in very high regard, because they Tube Screamer's secret. Yes, he is all $80 mini. Here's a Demon for $36. That's a clone, and it's more than likely true bypass. That's one thing I did want to talk about, was how it is a complex circuit. It uses what's called JFET bypass switching, which is not true bypass. It's JFET bypass switching, input buffer, output buffer. Here's the clipping section, followed up with the tone and volume section, and then the bypass in here. So it's just a dual op amp. Here's the clipping diodes. Son of Screamer would eliminate, more than likely be eliminating, I'm not sure, it definitely, that's set up to be a true bypass type of idea, which is done with a switch rather than a circuit. So the Son of Screamer or any type of Vero layout Tube Screamer you're going to find is not going to have any of this, and it might even skip the buffers, but a good one wouldn't. It would include the input and an output buffer, and then probably just a little less filtering for the powering section. You can see here the complicated JFET bypass switching. More. This is showing the true bypass alternative and what you would just be left with. Power supply filtering, input stage, that's the buffer, and then impedance calculations. The clipping amp we see here, it's a pair of MA150 silicon diodes. And here is the pot in the feedback loop. So you can see we're feeding the output back into the input, but through these clipping diodes, and there is a potentiometer here to limit or open that up for full feedback loop. Although when it's fully opened up, there's still a 51K resistor here, and you could mod that. You could place that. You could just put a jumper wire in there, and then when you turned your knob all the way up, it would have 51K less resistance, giving you more gain, theoretically. I could be wrong about that. Uses a non-inverting amp for the feedback loop. There's a low-pass filter, output buffer, the sound signature, the frequency response of the Tube Screamer. That's interesting. Tube Screamer myth. That sounds interesting. Let's read this. Despite the simple circuit and cheap components, the Tube Screamer's price has been rising year after year. Some players will pay a fortune for the pedals from the 80s releases, which in theory contain the original components which give the strongest classic Tube Screamer sound. This myth is strongly linked to the dual op amp JRC 4558 by Japan Radio Corporation, JRC, produced in the Jap facilities, used in the first pedal units that were eventually replaced by Malaysian clones, Texas Instruments, or Toshiba ICs. See, I wouldn't buy into that. It's the same die. And the die is what they cut the silicon for the chip internals. So if they're using the same die, trust me, the Japanese radio company is going to produce the same chips that are produced in Texas or Malaysia. there's going to be no difference. But it's different because people see it, that it's different, and that puts it in their mind that the reason that they're horrible at tuning their instrument, or they can't even play the theme from Peter Gunn, is blaming it on the chip. Some people also replace components for vintage technology like old carbon comp resistors with horrible tolerances instead of modern metal film resistors, and different capacitors. Well, the capacitor certainly would make a difference in the tone, and so would playing around by putting old resistors, because the tolerances mean with the tighter spec it's going to be 1% variance. Going down to 5% variance is going to give you much more leeway as far as how the circuit actually is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So all in all, what do I have to say about a tube screamer? Well, gee, if you're not going to be playing metal, hard rock, this would be enough for you. And if that's the case and you're willing to invest, yeah, a collection of tube screamers or trying out all different overdrives, that's definitely a hole that people fall into with their pedal board, having a bunch of overdrives that are slightly different and how they stack. If you're on a budget and you don't have a tube screamer, to be honest with you, I'm looking at over here on eBay. Now, obviously you would need to find out what the cheap clones are, not take my word for it. But this Demon is $29. You can get kits. Here's a build your own tube screamer kit, $26 for the kit. With a enclosure, it's $43. For that same price, for $29 for the kit, or what is it for the green screamer? It's the same price, $29.99 for the pedal finished. Here's the Ibanez Compact, $66. So I have to say, if you can get them cheap, if you've never tried it and you just want to try it, the Demon has 12 reviews and it's a 5-star, so it's a good pedal. I would say get one of those to try it out. Already are building and you don't have a tube screamer, you can go over to Tagboard Effects and take a look. They've got their Vero with a clipping switch mod, and you could very well put yourself together your own mojo, which would mean just hand select the parts, use blue or metal film resistors and test those, so make sure that they're really in tight tolerance. I mean, do you need to? Well, I do. I know I test every component that I put in every circuit. And now I've got a capacitance tester. I'm probably going to be testing the capacitor just to make sure that I'm getting tighter tolerance, depending on what it is, I should say. This calls for 2N5088. I know the 2N5088 is a wonderful high, it's a very popular part, but there's also the 5089, which is the low noise version. So if I was going to build myself a tube screamer, I would immediately think I would be using those 5089s, as well as the JRC 5088. As we saw, those are readily available. You could even search out and get yourself a Japanese one to make your own. So for about a third of the price, rather than buying an expensive Mojo one, you could put together your own. And as far as doing it cheaply, if you keep your eyes open, you're going to be able to find something used. But to be honest with you, the used market on tube screamers is not a big thing. People tend to hold on to them because it's not a one-trick pony. You can use it as a clean boost. You can use it as a gain boost. It's got that mid hump, which is really, it's a signal shaping device. So this stacks really well. You can have your tube screamer before another drive, have your favorite drive going, and then just step on your tube screamer just to give you enough boost to come through for your lead solo. So it's not something that you see on the used market, although you can find them. But it's not like certain pedals that you see where there's a lot of them, like the Dan Electro stuff, the Dan Electro distortion. You see a lot of those. I modified this, so I didn't want to do a demo, have it not really live up to sounds different. I went in here and replaced the clipping diodes. I put in a combination of germanium and an LED. The germanium gives it a different, spongier feel, I would say, and it's more clipping than an LED, but it lowers down the amount of volume. So to compensate for that, flip-flop in its polarity. I put in an LED. This is a good clone. It's a metal enclosure. Just I'm not really that hot on the switching, the way that the switching feels. Enough about my crappy Tube Screamer clone. Thank you for joining me for this episode.
Hey there, buddy. What's that sound? Hey there, buddy. What's that smell? It's Petey's Pets.